Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Scott. I'll be moderating this panel. This panel is titled Problem Places. Many of you, if you're familiar with Marcus Felsen and Larry Cohen's seminal theory on routine activity, we've used that framework. And it's routine activity theory, I think, more than almost any other criminological theory, has really permeated the police and the way the police are now thinking about dealing with crime and disorder. And so one of the ways in which we think about policing problems is in the context of routine activity theory. And some problems, although almost all problems have elements of all three elements, the offender, the victim, and the place in which it occurs, each problem tends to emphasize one or another. And so that's how we've organized the 5 panels, or 4 of the 5 panels that I'll be moderating at this conference. And this one is, we're thinking about these as problem places. There are elements of offenders and victims in each of these projects, but you'll hear as they're described how the police really fundamentally thought about the problem and how they ultimately went about addressing it. So the way in which we'll structure this, we've got 3 presentations here. Each of the panelists will take 20 minutes to present the essence of these projects as they were carried out by police in these jurisdictions. And then after they present, I invite them to offer some broader reflections on the significance of these examples of problem-oriented policing and what they really mean to the larger field of crime prevention and what implications they have for the policing of society, and invite you to offer some questions and answers yourselves. So the first presentation will be by Professor Ron Clark from Rutgers University, a previous winner of the Stockholm Prize in Criminology. And he's going to be presenting on an initiative that was the winner of the Herman Goldstein Award for problem-oriented policing over a decade ago. Ron? You might even show me how to use this thing. Forward, backward. Okay, thank you, the arrows.
Morning, everyone. If I've got a sort of startled deer look, it's because those lights are so strong that I can't see anything except blurs out there, but I'll do my best, okay? Right. I'm going to describe a project that was submitted for in fact, was the winner of the Goldstein Award in 2003. It's submitted by the Oakland Police Department concerning the transformation of the Oakland Airport Motel. So what I'm going to do is go through quickly the story of this transformation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the disappointing results of a longer follow-up, and I'm also going to talk about the larger significance of the project. This project was run by the Beat Health Unit, which was established by the Oakland Police Department as a specialized entity to implement problem-oriented policing. It was run for many years by the same sergeant, Bob Crawford. It focused largely on dilapidated residence homes that were plagued by crime and disorder and that were contributing to neighborhood blight. The BHU, the Beat Health Unit, had dealt with some 3,000 of these properties before it took on the Oakland Airport Motel. And the Oakland Airport Motel was a much larger facility than the usual Beat Health Unit project. target. Here's a picture of the Oakland Airport Motel as it is now, just to give you some kind of an idea of what we're talking about. Oakland Police Department officers were called very regularly to this motel to deal daily with complaints about robberies, thefts, prostitution, and drug dealing. There was also an illegal auto repair business operated in the motel's parking lot, and junk cars were regularly dumped there. Rooms were rented to minors, and some 25 guests had attained residency status at the property. It had an average of 9 times as many reported crimes as 5 other nearby motels. It had recently been renovated and had few building code violations, which the BHU was used to leveraging violations to get change, and it couldn't do this in this case. Visits to the nearby motels by the BHU led the officers to conclude that poor management practices at the Oakland Airport Motel had allowed crime and nuisance to flourish. So that was what was going on. This is the Oakland Airport Motel. They discovered that the Oakland Airport Motel was operated by an international parent company based in Europe, with many hundreds of motels in the United States and elsewhere. Now, I can't tell you what that parent company is called, because the account that I'm drawing on by the Oakland Police Department had an agreement that it would not mention the name of this parent company, so I can't tell you what it is. Sergeant Crawford's inquiries convinced him that the parent company had co-opted many police agencies in the United States by employing their officers as part-time security guards. So what I'm going to do now is just condense a long, long process that was gone through by the BHU trying to get change in the management practices and design of the motel. It was very long and complicated and really impressive, but I've had to sort of boil it down to get through the important points for this presentation. Basically, the key point came when a meeting was held with the parent company of the Oakland Airport Motel, and they agreed. There was an agreement reached at this meeting, which had taken a long time to set up, that the parent company would make changes to the property, that is the motel, and its management designed to reduce crime and disorder. This next point is very significant. They agreed to post a $250,000 performance bond to be forfeited if the problems were not eliminated within a 2-year period. And thirdly, they agreed to reimburse the City of Oakland $35,000 for the cost of the investigation of the motel. So that was a very significant meeting, and a lot of what follows.
Advance the slide one.
Sorry?
Advance the slide one.
Oh, advance it one. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was. Unfortunately, on this monitor, we've got the small version of the slide which I was reading, and the big version. But here's the here's the big version. So it was these three things that were agreed to. All very important, but it took a long time to get to this point. So what did they do? This is a summary of what was done. I should say, first of all, that the BHU did not tell the motel what to do. The reason being that if they followed the instructions from the BHU and the crime didn't fall, well then everything else would be forfeit. So the Oakland Airport Motel Management or the parent company, it was their responsibility to decide what to do. And this is what they did. A summary: they cleaned and painted the property, removed abandoned vehicles, raised room rates by 50%, upgraded lighting and fencing, replaced the managers and security guards and sacked problem employees, instituted pre-employment background checks on all new employees, established strict check-in procedures with a list of banned individuals, prohibited room rentals to anyone under 21, and prohibited room rentals for more than 30 days. That's a summary of what they did. There was more, but this was the main stuff. So how did that work? Well, it worked pretty well. This shows calls for service for the motel for previous years, from 1998 down to 2001, when the changes were implemented, and you can see that calls for service dropped off very considerably after these changes were implemented. So it was extremely successful. There wasn't any evidence of displacement. Calls for service at 5 comparable motels nearby were pretty much the same as with the Oakland Airport Motel after the intervention. There wasn't any real evidence that it had displaced the problem to other nearby motels. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the exceptional work that was led by the BHU. It did several things that were extremely clever. It formed a partnership with the city attorneys. Herman talked about the importance of getting the right people into a partnership. Formed a partnership with the city attorneys who could bring significant legal pressure to bear on the parent company of the motel. Because the BHU, the Beat Health Unit's lead officer, had little success working with the on-site manager and the VP for security, Vice President for Security of the US company, the BHU delivered a letter of pending legal action to the parent company's US chief executive at his home on Christmas Eve, just to make sure he'd be there. The city attorneys prepared a drug nuisance abatement lawsuit for the meeting on February 2nd, which I've talked about, between the city officials and the parent company's US chief executive officer and the VP of operations. And a certified letter was also sent to the international CEO, written in English and in the language of the country of his residence. The city's key requirement was this highly original performance bond, a very important innovation. So let's just have a look what happened after you've seen the effects of the introduction of these changes. I did a follow-up with the Oakland Police Department to try to find out what had happened since. If you look at this graph, you can see clearly the results of the intervention in 2000. The calls for service dropped precipitately. We call this a cliff edge drop, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So it dropped precipitously and stayed low for several years, but then it began to rise again, and gradually it rose up to levels beyond what the original problem was. So it had there was a valuable, fairly short-term, 2 or 3 years benefit, but the situation changed. So that was probably the result of changes in the managers of the motel, because the design changes probably didn't alter very much. It was probably management changes. So I now want to, how am I getting on for time, all right?
You can see,
Oh, okay.
11:25 is what.
Okay, well, I'm getting on just about all right. I want to talk now a little bit about the project's larger significance. Well, the BHU was extremely important in this project. And Herman has proposed that in his original paper that problem-oriented policing should replace incident-driven policing. But this has been achieved in only the smallest departments. There's very few departments that have actually switched over completely to problem-oriented policing. It's usually been very small ones. Larger departments have generally grafted on some dedicated problem-solving ability and capacity to particular patrol units. But the Oakland Police Force set up this specialized unit, the BHU, to undertake problem-oriented work. So that was something different. Sadly, despite its considerable success, the availability of supplemental local funds led to its rebirth. That the BHU was abandoned, and its resources were spread out to a dispersed team of public service officers, and we don't know the results of that. There wasn't any real, would have required a massive research effort to try to find out what happened as a result of that. So the BHU was a very specialized and important way to implement problem-oriented policing. Another important thing was the performance bonds. That they've not been previously used, as far as I could find out, and I don't think they've been used since, but I think they're of great importance in shifting and sharing responsibility. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. There was also implications for risky facilities, for cliff edge effects, and for super controllers. I'll try and get through all of those now. Let's have a look, first of all, at the shifting and sharing responsibility. You're probably familiar with Mike Scott's and Herman's prescriptions for shifting and sharing responsibility. Here they are arranged in order of increasing coercion. What the Oakland Airport Motel used was number 10, bringing a civil action to compel entities to accept responsibility for the problem. That is the parent company of the Oakland Airport Motel. Risky facilities, can't say very much about this, but the interesting thing is that the BHU undertook a rudimentary form of a risky facilities analysis when, during the scanning phase, it compared the cause for service of the Oakland Airport Motel with 5 other nearby motels and found that the Oakland Airport Motel had 9 times as many reported crimes as 5 of the other nearby motels. So that was a sort of risky facilities analysis which John Eck and colleagues, including me, put together as a formal idea, preventive ideas, risky facilities. Cliff edge effects, I want to say a little bit about this. For a host of practical reasons, which I'm sure many of you know, evaluations of situational crime prevention or problem-oriented policing rarely make use of randomized controlled trials. Consequently, they tend to be greatly disadvantaged by the Maryland criteria, which hold that randomized controlled trials are the most important form of evaluation. But problem-oriented policing and situational crime prevention often show dramatic, what Nick Ross calls dramatic cliff edge results, which is a sudden drop after the implementation of a measure. And you saw that clearly in the first slide. That's called a cliff edge decline. And I've argued in a paper recently that I think cliff edge declines like that, and there's plenty of examples in problem-oriented policing and situational prevention, are as powerful in showing a causal effect as a randomized control design. Now, that's arguable, of course, but that's what I think. All right, now my last point is about supercontrollers, which is a concept that John Eck and Rana Sampson developed. And the point here is that you can see the parent company as a supercontroller. It can bring pressure to bear on the local management. In fact, the concept of supercontrollers has always assumed, as it's written up, has assumed that supercontrollers exercise a beneficent what's the word? A beneficent role. But in fact, they don't always. And we have a very clear example here of a supercontroller that wasn't doing its job. And there's plenty of other examples of supercontrollers that don't do their jobs properly. And I think that we really need to rethink a little bit about the concept of supercontrollers, that sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not, and we need to understand a lot more about when they're not good and how we can bring pressure to bear on them when they are failing. I think we can do studies comparing crime rates of, let's say, motels and malls and hospitals which are either owned or not by corporate bodies, and see whether there are differences in the performance of the particular malls, hospitals, motels, whatever. So I think this is a work for the future, extending the concept of supercontrollers with the without assuming that they're generally doing a good job. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. So the next presentation was last year's winner of the Goldstein Award program, and it's from the Cincinnati, Ohio Police Department. And Professor Tamara Maddenson-Harold will present this project. Tamara?
Let's try this. We'll make it happen. Excellent. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. So, as Mike just pointed out, this is the POP winner 15 years later, and it was submitted by the Cincinnati Police Department. And I'm going to do my best to condense a very, very complex project, just as Professor Clark had explained. Lots of work, lots of interventions into a 20-minute presentation. And so I might go a bit quickly, but it has been written up, and there's other resources available. And I'm happy to discuss throughout the conference a little bit more about this project. It was referred to as PIVOT, Place-Based Investigations of Violent Offender Territories, and it was really focused on intervening at and disrupting some of those persistent violent locations that you find in urban communities. And for those of you not familiar with the city of Cincinnati, it's located in southwest Ohio, just north of the Ohio River. It has a population of about 300,000 people. The police department itself has about 1,000 sworn, 125 civilian personnel, and like many U.S. cities, it has experienced dramatic increases in violent crime over time and is looking for ways to address this. And as you can see, Cincinnati is much higher in terms of their violent crime statistics, much higher than the national average, and also much higher than some of the surrounding jurisdictions. In 2015, that was sort of the origins of this project. So Cincinnati was experiencing a dramatic spike in violent crime, and it was garnering national attention. And in particular, if you were looking at some of the shooting statistics, you would see that that year, things had kind of jumped off the charts. So, on average, these are shooting victims, not shootings. So you had, on average, you're looking at about 410 shooting victims per year. In 2015, this had jumped up to 479. And so Cincinnati was really interested in developing a new approach to reducing violent crime across the city. And as we know, violent crime concentrates, and so we thought, okay, what could we do? We looked at some of our previous interventions, and there had been some success in Cincinnati in driving down violent crime using some of the strategies that the panel this morning had discussed, which were offender-focused strategies, the focused deterrent strategies. And so the city police department had partnered with some academics, and they came up with this focused deterrent strategy they referred to as SERVE, and they were able to drive down violent crime. The interesting thing, though, as we see these declines in crime, is that they're very difficult to sustain over time. So you'd have a dramatic reduction, sort of the cliff edge effect that we saw with the previous presentation, and then you would see it start to creep back up. So in developing out this particular violence reduction strategy, we really wanted to focus on grounding the strategy in some of the more recent advances in crime place theory, focusing on what we could do about place, but also what we could do about victim resiliency and incorporate this into a broader city-wide response. And I think this was something that Professor Goldstein had mentioned this morning as well. So I'll start with how we first went about trying to identify the problem. And so here's a traditional density hotspot map. I know that Julie Wartel's in the audience, and she hates these maps. But I will draw your attention to two things about this map. First of all, you'll see that crime concentrates, violent crime concentrates. We know that it does. And you see the concentrations there. And what's really interesting, the second thing is, although these spots will cool down and heat up over time, they remain relatively consistent over time. And so there's a very talented analyst, I cannot give credit to everybody who worked on this project, very talented analyst who went back and looked at, which of these spots were chronic, were persistent over an extended period of time. And he identified 23 of these violent, what we call micro-locations, right? 23 very, very violent locations, about a 2-block radius each. And when we looked inside of those 23 micro-locations, those 23 micro-locations made up only 1.4% of the city in terms of total land mass, yet they accounted for over 14% of all Part 1 crimes, over 25% of all violent crimes, and the most shocking statistic was that over 42% of the people who were shot in Cincinnati were being shot in those tiny micro locations. So crime was highly concentrated in these locations. And something else that happened in 2015, there was an officer, Officer Kim, who was shot and killed in the line of duty. And so one of the other things that we wanted to look at in the scanning phase was what was going on with officers in these locations. And so we see the same thing with that 1.4% of landmass accounts for a disproportionate proportion of officer injuries and also non-compliant suspect behaviors, which creates dangerous conditions for officers. So at this point, we're looking at these locations. We know that violent crime, particularly gun crime, is a problem in these places. It's having a tremendous negative impact on the residents, also the officers who are responding to these locations. And so what we did was we set about trying to structure our analysis around 4 research questions, 4 hypotheses really, but 4 research questions. And the first question we asked was the question that I asked a little bit earlier, or had alluded to, and that is, why are there some hotspots that persist over time? We know that focused police intervention can reduce crime and can have a significant impact for at least short periods of time, but cities have hotspots that persist for years, sometimes even decades, despite our strategic deployment of resources. And so in answering this question, not long before Pivot was developed, there were some recent advances in crime place theory and understanding of places and how they're used by offenders. And so now we know that there's 4 types of places commonly used by offenders. The first is the crime site. This is the location that shows up on our crime maps. We're most familiar with these locations. But Marcus Felsen had also suggested earlier that there were convergent settings, public locations that offenders use to convene, meet, and plan crimes, discuss. So we have these convergent settings. In addition, we have what we call comfort spaces, which are like convergent settings, but they're not public, they're private, and offenders use these locations to stash drugs, plan crimes, control the weapons that they're going to use in the commission of their crimes. And then finally, we have corrupting spots, which are businesses that may or may not generate calls for service, but they contribute to the crime problem. So imagine the location that's laundering money or buying stolen goods or services. These are the corrupting spots. Together, these locations, we hypothesize, form a crime place network. Just like offenders are networked, victims are networked, places are also networked. If we are strategic, we go in and remove the offender network, which is what SERVE and Focused Deterrence aims to do. We will have an impact, but it will be limited because we leave what we call this criminal infrastructure in place. We leave this behind. And as I pointed out earlier, this is what we see on crime maps, but these other places would remain unseen without some sort of systematic investigation into what this crime place network looks like. So our second question was, could we develop a systematic problem-solving process that could sustain reductions in these hotspots? And so here's the general model that was developed after lots of analysis, lots of focus groups, and a lot of work that went into developing this out. And so the first step was to prioritize those micro hotspots for intervention, to figure out which ones we wanted to go after first. Then investigate those networks of offenders using that SERVE initiative, but also at the same time, develop a team that can conduct investigations of places and uncover those place networks. In order to disrupt those networks, do not rely just on police, but as we've been talking about earlier, use a coordinated citywide effort to address the problem and leverage all of the resources of the community, and then sustain reductions by focusing on building victim resiliency, coordinating all of the resources that we have to help redevelop these locations. And of course, when you look at this, this looks very familiar. All we've done is take the SARA process and just give a more detailed, structured playbook, if you will, for what to do at each of these stages in order to disrupt these networks and address gun violence in these micro locations. So one of the things that was also developed was a pivot review board. So this was all of the city departments and representatives from all of those departments that were brought together. And Herman had mentioned this earlier, but after the police went in and conducted their investigations and identified these locations, would present those investigations to this review board, who would then figure out how can we leverage our resources to disrupt the dynamics in all of these different locations. And our third question here, I can't spend much time on it, but there's documentation on this. So for those of you in the audience who are interested in analysis and crime analysis and how we measured all of this, I just want to introduce it because I'll show you some results in just a second. Our crime analysts had developed a a gun violence metric, which was very important because it's very difficult to assess change in events that are relatively rare, right? So gun violence isn't as common as property crime, so how do we assess change as we're working through these things to figure out which of our interventions are working and which were not? And just to show you what he did with this gun violence metric, his name's Blake, he weighted each incident by type and data source, so there was a weighting scheme there, and there was also a weighting scheme by time that had passed, as well as distance from the locations that we're looking at. So using all this, these are the violence scores that you're going to see, and again, I can give you more information on this. But this is what we use to measure change over time. And then finally, the final question was, would our investigations uncover the networks that we had proposed exist, these crime place networks in these chronic hotspots? And the short answer to this is yes. Yes, they did. And so I'm going to give you just a brief overview of what some of these networks looked like. In Cincinnati, things had changed from the time that it was first developed out, the strategy, and so they picked 2 locations to roll this out in, sort of these pilot locations. One was in East Westwood, one was in Westwood. Cincinnati's made up of 52 different communities, and these communities have identities, and it's very important if you know Cincinnati, you know its geography, to refer to the actual communities. And Westwood and East Westwood, although they share a very similar name, are actually very different types of communities. But they both had one of these chronic micro hotspots inside of it. So this is East Westwood, and this is a photo that was taken just after one of the very common drive-by shootings that would occur in this location. And so the pivot commander, Matt Hammer, Lieutenant Matt Hammer and his team, he went into this particular location and he wanted to see what was going on with the places here. So here you have just a general map here depicting where some of the crimes were occurring and what was happening. You had people coming by here, committing shootings along this drive here. You have a couple of different convenience stores, local markets on each side of the street here. And you can see, so you'd have people lined up, parking their cars here, dealing drugs along the sidewalk, people coming back, committing shootings, both retaliatory shootings and from time to time robberies as well. The houses that are right here along the drive where they committed the shootings had overgrown grass, obviously substantial code violations. If you go into the back of these homes, you would find drug distribution centers or evidence of drug distribution centers, bagging and weights and other paraphernalia associated with drugs. In that tall grass, you'd find things like ammunition, community guns, so guns placed in that grass strategically for when there was a drive-by for the offenders in that area to be able to respond. And so his team was going in, investigating these places and finding all of this evidence that there were surrounding locations to the crime site that were being used as part of this crime place network. And so Matt and his team created these schematics. And again, with their investigations, they would systematically present this to the Pivot Review Board and figure out how to disrupt what was going on in this network. And so in Westwood, again, a different type of community, a different type of structure to the network. So one of the most important places here was this place called US Market. This is a Shell station, a gas station right across the street here, and the violence was concentrated very much in this area. You'd see this is a picture of the market at night. You'd have people congregating, not a lot of place management going on, lots of shootings happening in this location. You had nearby apartment buildings. This is Matt's funny joke, and if he was here, he'd deliver it much better, but he'd say most of the time you have to ask apartment owners to put better locks on doors. For this apartment, he had to ask them to put on a door because it was just missing, so there were lots of problems with nearby locations that were part of this place network. People leaving love notes to the police, and also some of the other gangs that might be in the area, and again, lots of facilitators that were left, footpaths and other things being used by offenders, lots of evidence of gun violence in the area. Did the same thing, creates the schematic, goes in, does the investigation, and then presents that information, and they look for ways to disrupt that network. So in terms of response and assessment, when they went into this, using the model, Mike Scott's diagram here of what this looks like, the SARA process, there's a lot of real-time information. Because they had that violence scoring method, they could know once they implemented something, what happened to violence in that area. And I can't go over all of the interventions that they used to disrupt all of these dynamics in all these places, but I can give you some examples here. These are the violence scores plotted along here, and then when the location or when the interventions took place. And so this problematic area here, where you had drive-by shootings and people dealing with drugs, they contacted those property owners, and they gained control over the properties by enforcing code enforcement, making sure that that grass wasn't long and being used by the offenders. They actually restricted parking, traffic and engineering restricted parking along that location so that the offenders could not use cards as barricades or to conceal some of their dealing. So this is what it kind of looked like after. It was a very different place once they put up these parking restrictions. Again, working code enforcement to deal with some of those problematic owners. This parking lot was a disaster. They actually painted parking places. It sounds simple, but sometimes that controls a lot of the disorder that's going on there. Secured dumpsters, put in lighting, temporary lighting, and then permanent lighting in some of these problematic locations. And in the second location, same thing, you're looking at violence scores and some of the interventions here. And again, I can't go over all of the interventions, but the US market was really one of the primary problem locations. They conducted undercover investigations, were able to show that the managers were actually selling drug paraphernalia, helping to facilitate the drug market in the area, using court action, going after leveraging some of that. They actually seized this property from that owner, sold it to a local rabbi who now sells fresh produce to the community from local gardens. There also has a thrift store where you can earn credits by volunteering. You can come in, you can get groceries, you can buy clothes, do a variety of things there. They moved some bus stops, some other SEPTED type information, but they really worked with the community in order to do these things, making sure the community was behind a lot of these interventions and supported the changes that were occurring in those areas. I don't have time to show you this clip, but I can send it to you, which is a very cool news clip of how they conducted the undercover operations and then eventually shut down that market, which was really helpful. And then the last piece of this, in Cincinnati, they have this neighborhood enhancement program that had been working all throughout the city, but what they did was dovetail their efforts onto what Pivot was doing. So Pivot would go in, identify these place networks, disrupt the dynamics, remove the bad, and then Ethel, who is in charge of this program, as she said, would push in the good. So she coordinated many of the volunteer efforts, the redevelopment efforts in these areas, and helped to change the dynamics of that neighborhood so that, again, they could work together, be more resilient, and sustain over time. So just a quick follow-up on assessment here. With the white background, this is before Pivot went into effect, and then as it turns dark, you'll see this is after Pivot went into effect, and you see the violence change scores. It starts to cool down to almost nothing there, and the overall trend, the rest of the city, their violence change score went down about 8.7%, but in East Westwood, it went down almost 90%. Violence in that particular area. We looked for displacement. We found a slight increase in the buffer area, but no significant evidence of displacement at this particular site. And so here you see the difference in the violence change scores, really dramatic over time. And then at our second site, same thing. This was pre-intervention, so you can see where the hot spots are popping up over time, and then post-intervention, you'll see what happens after Pivot is implemented, that violence starts to go down dramatically. And again, this particular location had a reduction of over 70% in their violence change score too, and instead of displacement, as we often see in the literature, we see this diffusion of benefits to nearby locations. And again, change score over time and what that looked like. So we were fortunate enough to be asked to present this project for the UK POP conference, and so we gave a much larger version and description of this project, and these were the numbers then. So I called to find out how we were doing in East Westwood and Westwood today. This was about 100 days ago, and so they had gone a year and about 100 days without a shooting at all. Where you see before, this was pre-intervention, you had 2 or 3 people being shot in these locations per month. They'd gone about 120 days. They recently had a shooting. They're very disappointed in this. But if you look over time at the numbers of shootings that have been prevented, it's very, very impressive. And this here, Westwood, they'd gone 271 days without a shooting. They had a couple of hot months where they had a couple of shootings. Went another 160 days. They're now up to 260 days with no shootings in those locations. We did do some community surveys here, and I won't have time to go over this, but just to know that in general, people felt much better about what was going on in their communities over time. And again, talking to the residents about what their perceptions are is extraordinarily important. And so just to wrap up, implementation challenges, the same thing that Professor Clark was talking about, staffing over time, making sure that these projects get the attention that they deserve and that they're sustained over time can be really challenging. Some of the buy-in from those review board members, but a lot of that has changed. And one of the things I think the greatest impediments to adopting a strategy like this is that people want something to reduce crime now, but conducting these types of place network investigations takes time. And it takes a training of officers to think differently, that they're not just focusing on offenders, but also on the places that facilitate the dynamics. And so right now in Cincinnati, they're working in a new neighborhood. It's Avondale. They've had, again, they're demonstrating tremendous success with this particular strategy. And if you're interested in this, obviously, please feel free to contact me. But here is the lieutenant who is the commander of the pivot unit in case you'd like any of his contact information. And you can find much more about this both through Mike Scott and his publication of the Goldstein presentation, but then also on the CPD's website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tamara. And then our third presentation will be from Australia, and Professor Lorraine Mazerow, whom you've met before, and Paul Morton, also from the Queensland Police Service, talk about drug dealing in some of the hotels in Queensland.
Just a quick click on this one. Yeah, great. Yep. Great, well thank you very much everyone and for staying around for the third presentation. Before I start, I would really like to acknowledge the project partners in this, particularly Paul Morton from the Queensland Police Service and Mike Newman, Detective Inspector with the Queensland Police Service, my colleague Kelsey, who's in the audience out there, and my colleague Sarah Bennett at the University of Queensland. So this is beautiful Brisbane. It's a city, a growing city. It's got over 1 million people just in the city. The Queensland Police Service that services not just the city of Brisbane but the whole of the state of Queensland is a police department with nearly 15,000 officers. So it's a large police organisation. It's a city that has over 120 hotels just in the central business district and surrounding areas. And I'm sure most of you are from out of town and you're probably staying in a nice hotel with someone coming in every day refreshing your towels and making up your beds. However, lots of people choose not to be disturbed. So if you are staying in a hotel, the universal sign, if you don't want to be disturbed, is to put the Please Do Not Disturb sign up. However, Paul Morton and his city CIB, Criminal Investigations Bureau of the Queensland Police Service, were noticing that there was a lot of problems in behind those closed doors of hotel rooms. So they were observing a whole lot of different problems. They were going into these hotel rooms that were being used to distribute and use drugs. There was a lot of cash that was being used that was being stored in the hotel rooms. And one of the things that they were noticing was people putting shower caps over the fire detective alarm, and this was to stop any of the fumes from the drugs that were being produced in the hotel rooms from setting off the fire alarms, which of course creates a massive potential fire hazard. So the Queensland Police Service and the detectives in particular knew that they weren't really engaging with the hoteliers. Over the course of the prior to the project, the police department across the board was only receiving about 11 drug crime reports per month. There was a tremendous lack of trust, a lack of confidence between the police and the hoteliers, and there was a lot of a lack of place management, and the hoteliers certainly weren't proactively engaging with the police. So Paul came to one of our workshops and came up with a desire to change the nature of the drug dealing behind closed doors in hotels. And him and his team came up with a logo, Operation Galley they called it, No Room for Drugs, which I think is a pretty fantastic way of tagging the project. So we sat with Paul and his team to sort of get from the police what is it that they wanted to do in terms of dealing with these drug problems. And so they activated what we called a third-party policing intervention, where they wanted to actively partner with the hoteliers, but they also they knew that there was a whole lot of laws that the hoteliers had to abide by in terms of providing a safe place for people for the customers in the hotels. So they really were looking at the regulatory laws and the legislation that drove the hoteliers. So they came up with a 3-component intervention. The first was that they wanted to engage the hoteliers as willing place managers, that they wanted to gain this willing compliance with the laws. The second thing was that they wanted to communicate the range of different legislation that the hoteliers had to abide by. So they identified the Work and Health and Safety Act, the Fire and Emergencies Act, which meant that this activity of putting a shower cap over the fire alarm was a violation of the Fire and Emergency Services Act and the Drug Misuse Act. And the way that we talked about these legal levers was as part of what we would call the regulatory pyramid. Now, what's significant about this graphic of how the police wanted to engage with the hoteliers was to really look at building the capacity for willing compliance. So the idea was that the place managers would be engaged in a way that wouldn't lead to prosecution, that it wouldn't lead to them ending up having to have some sort of a penalty at the top of the regulatory pyramid, but rather that they were working with them as a learning citizen at the bottom of that pyramid. The third component was that in engaging the hoteliers and communicating to them their legislative responsibilities, they wanted to engage them using the dialogue of procedural justice. And we've done a lot of work in this area about trying to script the dialogue of how do you convey trustworthy motives, how do you convey dignity and respect, how do you give the hoteliers some voice, what were some of the problems that they were experiencing and why weren't they engaging with the police. So we put this language of procedural justice into a dialogue that the police themselves workshopped over a number of weeks with us to really get the flow of the conversation. But we're also interested to see whether or not a letter that still conveyed all of the responsibilities of the hoteliers was actually enough. So we would call these nudge letters. So the letters that we created were very, very similar in terms of the language of procedural justice policing and giving them some knowledge of the sorts of signs that were there for drug dealing behind hotel rooms. So this is a randomised controlled trial. We randomly allocated the 120 hotels in the city area into 3 groups. The personal group received a visit from the city CIB detectives, and they used that visit to activate the dialogue of procedural justice, to communicate to the hoteliers what their responsibilities were, and with the idea of gaining that willing compliance. The 40 of the hotels were randomly allocated to the letter-only group, and 40 of them randomly allocated to get business as usual. In terms of the baseline equivalents, the personal group, letter group and the business as usual group were similar in terms of the size of the hotels, the star ratings, the amount of previous pre-intervention crime reports, and the distribution of the spatial distribution of the hotels in the three different groups were quite evenly spaced across the city landscape. We did look at 3 time periods, a pre-period of about 18 months, the intervention period, which represented the time that the city CIB detectives engaged with the hoteliers, the 40 hoteliers in the personal visit group, and when the letters were sent to the ones in the letter group, and then we've tracked the impact of the intervention over a 9.5 month period. Now, I'm going to invite Paul up to talk to you a little bit more about the intervention and about the results. And I really do want to emphasise that this was a project that Paul and his team initiated, and this is really your baby. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Lorraine. Good morning, everyone. So from the outset, as a detective with the Queensland Police Service in Australia, I was really keen to better engage with the hoteliers, to enlist their support as crime control partners and place managers. From my point of view, one of the most important goals of Operation Galley was to build trust with the hoteliers so that they would work with us to address the hotel drug crime. Therefore, we set out to make hoteliers more aware of the signs of drug dealing, make them aware of their legal rights and obligations in respect of hotel drug crime, in line with third-party policing, give them clear avenues to report suspicious drug activity, and in line with the procedural justice message, ultimately make them more willing to engage with police and report information. At the time, this was a real change for detectives. As opposed to being reactive, investigating crime after it is committed, being enforcement-oriented and focused on arrests, Operation Galley was about being proactive and engaging in industry as a crime control partner to solve crime problems. This was a new and unique approach, and at odds, in a way, to what the detective culture is. We set about measuring the impact of Operation Galley and the 3 RCT conditions or groups by measuring the quantity of notifications received. So these are the notifications from hoteliers to detectives concerning suspicious drug activity, and we considered the intervention and post-intervention periods. We also considered the number of drug search warrants executed. These are searches conducted of the hotel rooms for drugs and drug-related property, and we considered the pre-intervention, intervention and post-intervention periods. And we also considered the number of drug crime reports. Now, drug crime reports are entered by police onto the police system when a drug offence has been detected, and we considered the 3 periods for that also. In the short term, we were interested in building trust with the hoteliers so they would work with us. But over time, we expect Operation Galley will make hotels unattractive to drug dealers. The first outcome measure is notifications. We anticipated that by actually meeting with hoteliers, they would be more trusting of police and more willing to cooperate with our request to be notified about drug dealing. However, we are also interested in the letter group, the letter condition, from a cost-benefit perspective. Would this nudge be all that was needed to engage the hoteliers as learning citizens, thereby building their capacity to recognise and notify police about drug dealing activities? This graph shows the monthly average notifications by condition or group and period, where the Operation Galley or personal visit group is represented in blue, the letter group in red, and business as usual in green. Overall, there were 114 notifications across the groups for the combined intervention and post-intervention periods, a period of approximately 11 months, which we found this to be very encouraging. During the intervention period, there was an average of 14.4 notifications per month from the personal group, compared with 2.4 for the letter group. During the post-intervention period, there was an average of 6.53 notifications from the personal visit group, compared with less than 1 for the letter group. These results suggest that hoteliers, subject of a personal visit by detectives, were stimulated and more willing to report suspicious drug activity, and that the letter, on the other hand, was ineffective. The graph also shows a decline in notifications over time. This is likely reflective of some level of suppression in the drug problem, or it could also be the result of a waning of interest on behalf of hoteliers. As a result, we saw the need to reinforce the operation over time. The second outcome measure is executed search warrants. This graph shows repeated measures, general linear model analysis for average monthly executed search warrants, split based on whether or not they were a result of an Operation Galley notification. This is the graph on the left, or via alternative reporting or detection methods, the graph on the right. So time point 1 on the x-axis represents the monthly average for the pre-intervention period. Time point 2 represents the monthly average for the combined intervention and post-intervention periods. Examining the left graph, it is clear that the increased notifications in the personal group resulted in an increase in the number of search warrants executed, as represented in blue, whilst there were decreases over time for the other two groups, the letter and business as usual group, the red and green lines respectively. The right side graph depicts executed search warrants which were a result of all other avenues, so not the result of an Op Galley notification. This graph shows all three conditions had decreases in executed drug search warrants between the pre-intervention period and the combined intervention and post-intervention period. This shows that we not only received a high number of notifications, but the information provided by hoteliers was accurate, reliable, and actionable by way of a search warrant. The third outcome measure is drug crime reports. These are the reports that are entered by police onto the police system when a drug offence has been detected, and typically when an offender or offenders have been arrested. A drug offence is detected and a drug crime report entered when police act on information provided via a number of different avenues, like Operation Galley, or just as a result of a police-initiated activity. These other avenues are report a drug dealer, which is an online HTML form accessed via the Queensland Police Service website, reporting via local police stations, whether it be via telephone or in person, reporting via the Queensland Police Service Police Link customer call centre, and reporting via Crime Stoppers. This graph shows a repeated measures GLM analysis for average monthly crime reports split based on whether or not they were a result of Op Galley notification, again the graph on the left, or via alternative reporting or detection methods, the graph on the right. Examining the left side graph, drug crime reports are higher in the Operation Galley personal group, again represented by the blue line, in comparison with the letter and business as usual groups, the red and green lines respectively, because rates of detection and apprehension of offenders is greater. The right side graph depicts drug crime reports which were a result of all those other avenues, so not the result of an Operation Galley notification. This graph shows that all three conditions had decreases in drug crime reports. Therefore, we see a clear follow-through from Operation Galley notifications through to search warrants to drug crime reports. In summary, Operation Galley enhanced place management and built crime control capacities with hoteliers. Increased notifications for suspicious drug activity for the personal visit group was experienced only, and this resulted from more trust in and cooperation with police. The increase in notifications, cooperation and trust was sustained beyond the intervention period. The increase in Operation Galley notifications translated into more search warrants and more drug crime reports. And the nudge letter didn't work. Its impact was no different to the business as usual group. 5 things we don't yet know. Did Operation Galley suppress the drug dealing problem, or did it merely stimulate hotelier engagement? Did the hoteliers take on a larger crime control role, or did they simply just contact detectives more? Was there any displacement to the problem to other hotels or geographical areas? Did drug dealers change the way they rented hotels? And did customers perceive less of a problem, or were they unaware from the outset? Whilst these questions remain unanswered at this time, what we do know is detectives must use their problem-solving skills and get more involved in investigating and solving crime problems, and that this can be achieved by engaging third parties and enlisting their support as crime control partners and place managers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul and Lorraine. I appreciate your indulgence in listening to all these, so I'd like to offer an opportunity for any questions or comments from the audience. And if you just wait for the microphone to come to you so we can record your question. Now you're out now, Joe.
Thanks for this opportunity. Paul Ekblom, University College London. Just a comment on Ron Clark's presentation, which, of course, I enjoyed. He was talking about the issue of place managers and super controllers who didn't do their job and allowed crime to happen. I have a concept for that, which is crime promoters, which I think you might find useful.
Thanks. Joe Coons, University of North Carolina at Charlotte. I actually have an interesting question that might involve all three of you, but it's sort of based on Ron's initial talk where he talked about the cliff. I don't quite recall the precise name, but the cliff effect, right?
Cliff edge drop.
And it's an interesting thing to think about, cliff edge drop, because in POP, we often have difficulty implementing experimental designs. Lorraine's really good at it. You guys did well in Cincinnati. And then we often don't have enough time to really measure a sustained effect. So Ron first, and then maybe you guys could chime in. How would you assess the cliff edge effect? I mean, is there a quantitative effect that you're looking for, or is it a proportional effect? And then would you guys who are more experimentally design focused buy into this idea? Because I do. It makes sense to me, given the context of how we implement POP.
So, Ron, if I've got Joe's question right, is there a way that you could be more specific about what would constitute a cliff edge drop? Is there a quantitative percentage of drop in a certain period of time, or is it a more general concept at this stage?
Yes, well,
it's working. Yeah, just talk into it.
Is this all right? Can you hear? A cliff edge drop, by the way, that isn't my name. It's Nick Ross called these drops cliff edge. I'm not sure there's a real way to quantify it. I think it's very obvious when you see one, like you did with the original graph from the airport, from the motel study. It does need more refinement and more thinking about, but I mean, to me, I think I have seen in many cases very huge drops, and I wouldn't even use statistics with them. They're just so obvious. But probably we need to work on this concept more. At the moment, it's just a sort of an idea that these things happen very often in situational crime prevention and problem-oriented policing, and they do constitute a causal argument. You can see the drop right in front of you, so there's no doubt something happened. But you're right, we need to think about it a lot more in more depth. Is that okay?
Any of the other panelists want to comment on Joe's question?
No, I agree. Is this on?
I think if you just talk into it, it will.
Hello? Yeah, good. Okay. Excellent. You can't hear yourself. It's very strange. So I agree with what Ron's saying, and I think we've done, in terms of you asking Joe about sustainability, we use this really arbitrary cutoff of 12 months when we're evaluating studies, and we say, well, how long was their follow-up period? And if it's 12 months, we are all very satisfied. But as you saw in Ron's graph, that effect sustained over a few years, and now the problem is worse than when it started. So what do we consider a sustained crime reduction? Even in Cincinnati, where this is 2.5 years out now, is that long enough? And what do we consider this cliff edge effect and then another spike up? How long does it have to be in order to consider a crime reduction effect to have been sustained? So that's an interesting question.
Malcolm.
Hi, Malcolm Sparrow from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Quick comment on the last question. I think the official statistical approach is time series intervention analysis that looks at the variance of the prior pattern, and then you can tell when in 1 year something bizarre and way out of the ordinary has happened. And of course the drawback is you can't tell what it was. You can just see that there is a severe effect there of some kind. Two quick questions, one for Paul. You had a very interesting slide of things you don't know. And it struck me that many of them you'd know if you had a bit of human intelligence, that you sat down and talked to a couple of informants and listened to what the drug dealing world was prepared to tell you about the way they viewed hotels. And I wondered what role human intelligence or the use of informants had in that capacity. And one other quick question for Ron. Unless I missed it, I don't think you told us what was the nature of the resurgence after the effective intervention period. I'd be curious to know what that was and if it's been studied and if it was something quite different happening or the old thing coming back. It does strike me that there's a lesson in the problem-solving protocol. Normally, once you've got the effect that you want and it's time to withdraw or close a project, you don't forget it. You put it in some kind of long-term monitoring or maintenance phase with triggers that will alert you quickly if something appears again, either the old thing coming back or a new form emerging. And I wondered if there was that discipline present in this case, or whether it just wasn't a part of the accepted problem-solving protocol. Thank you.
We'll start with Paul's response.
Yeah, Operation Galley was really conceived as a result of human source intelligence. By talking to sources, we became aware that the hotels were being sought out by them because it afforded them anonymity, the ability to move around, so mobility, or hotel hopping, as we refer to it. And it also brought them closer to their market. They were in the centre of the city, closer to patrons of the entertainment precincts and attendees at music festivals. So their whole rationale behind the hotel rooms was to reduce the likelihood of detection. And going forward in terms of Operation Galley, some offenders that we've intercepted have naturally become human sources, and we really are looking to exploit opportunities in that regard going forward in terms of expanding our intelligence and target development in terms of protracted drug operations.
Ron?
Is it working? Yep. Why did the calls for service increase after several years? That was your question, right? Well, I don't really know why it happened, but I think what went on was that there was a change, probably a change in management would be my guess, that somebody moved from the local manager. And I think that the police department didn't keep pressure on the motel. And obviously the parent company didn't exercise any role either. So it's pretty unclear what went on, and I without a great deal of more investigation, I don't know that I can answer that question. But I suppose we can be grateful at least that there was several years where the crimes were really suppressed. But why it climbed again is, I think, largely due to the inability to do anything about getting the parent company to take some responsibility for the situation. I don't think they did. I think they did their bit. They got their didn't have to pay the performance bond, and then just gave up. That's my guess. Not very satisfactory.
Some of in addition to that, Ron and I were both collaborating to try to follow up with the Oakland police all these years later. And we discovered there were changes in leadership at the district level, certainly at the chief executive level in the organization, and even the sergeant that Ron mentioned, Bob Crawford, retired after 35 or 40 years on the job. And he was really the linchpin of that Beat Health unit. Then we also discovered that they changed records management systems at some point shortly after the Oakland Airport Motel project was concluded, and they had a very difficult time telling us what happened. So we ended up relying on the calls for service data, which is aggregate data. It didn't tell us a lot about exactly what was the nature of what was happening. But it did seem to us that the city of Oakland and the Oakland police had kind of dropped the ball. They lost sight of this as a problem. And we can only hope that Ron's inquiry into this might re-energize them. Paul?
Yeah. All right.
Oh, I'm sorry, Marcus.
Yeah, okay. By the way, I would hate to be in the hospital and discover the surgeon had retired in the middle of my operation and be replaced by someone who knew nothing about it.
And that happens in policing all the time. It does.
One of the things I've noticed in the social sciences have been quite accustomed to over the decades, having things that don't work very well. And then you have several, 3 or 4, 5 theories that don't work very well. And then the contenders use statistical methods to try to decide which one's better, but they never settle on it because A isn't really working much better than B, and if you change the methods a little, it shifts. And so we keep going through these cycles with no improvement over time. Then we finally come across some things that work much better, and nobody will believe it. And so they say, well, have you controlled for these 30 variables? Or have you tried this method, or can you prove that, or if you wait another 5 years, maybe it'll fail. And so in a sense, we can't get any progress because we're applying our same insecurity over all the years of failure in what's now what should be, is becoming potentially a golden age of success. And I just want to hear Ron's reaction to that. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Marcus. Well, I agree with you completely. That's why I particularly like this cliff edge thing. The results are so sharp that it's very hard to quarrel with that something has happened. If you've got one measure that declines very greatly, you don't really need to argue about what has produced it if you've already produced an argument as to why this should have declined. And I agree with you about all this complex statistics. I don't think... I'll be a bit careful here because I don't do complex statistics, but I find it's very hard to understand quite what's happening by the time all these different manipulations have been run on the statistics, and it all for me, it disappears into a fog of numbers that I can't make any sense of. Is that really what you were saying?
Yes, and a lot of the people who do it don't understand the statistics.
Hervé Borjan from UCL. Question for Ron Clark, trying to drill again in that really interesting case study. So there was this bond that the company would have to pay if they were not successful, the performance bond. And the measure of success here was the number of service calls. Who actually made those calls? Was it the hotel that kind of centralized them, or did they come from other stakeholders? Because of course, if it's the hotel, they had an incentive for not reporting some of the incidents, and so the underreporting could be their approach to not pay the money in the end.
So I think the question is whether we know whether the required reduction in calls for service to the motel could be achieved by the hotel deciding not to call the police anymore, or whether in the evaluation they had a way of controlling for who was calling the police, whether these were independent external calls. Do we know much about that from this study?
Well, no, I mean, you're right. We don't really know that the motel was no longer calling. But it wasn't just the motel calling. It was also people in the motel, using the motel and so on, that were calling. So it wasn't simply to do with what the motel was doing. So I think it's a genuine drop. But again, there's always the possibility that the motel was certainly not calling as often as it did. What proportion of the calls are from the motel and what proportion from people who are using the motel, I don't think we've got that data.
No. In some other contexts, we have seen police say to this problem property manager, if you call us, we will not hold that against you. If other people call us, we will hold that against you, at least for an interim period, so that they don't have this incentive to hide the problem. Where were we going next? Paul?
I think all these excellent presentations have raised a major issue in what we can call implementation science. The issue of tick over support in order to maintain an effect. When do you keep supporting something? How long do you keep going? At some point, are you flogging a dead horse? Are you into diminishing returns? Does it need a major refresh, or do you need to go off and put all your resources somewhere else? There's also the issue of planned and unplanned exit strategies, which need to be considered. And are there areas of public management which can give us lessons in maintenance of continuity? For example, does public health do continuity better than the police seem to?
Malcolm, you might even have an answer to this from your research, but first opportunity, any thoughts from the panel?
Thank you, Paul. Look, I think you're absolutely right, and there's a point at which it's very helpful to have like a booster shot. So I think what Paul was alluding to was the need to go back to the hoteliers that had the personal visit and provide that kind of booster shot. And then the next question you're asking then is, well, how many booster shots do you need before you're expending, you get to the point of diminishing returns? And then if you don't, how long do you have some sort of immunity from the problem? So I think Ron's case is a classic example of when the immunity has worn off. And I think that it poses great challenges for police in terms of, all of those interventions. There was 10 different things that occurred, and with one change of personnel you can see the whole thing crumbling down. So I do think that for these sort of initiatives, there needs to be some inbuilt sustainability, and I think what Paul was sort of driving at was how the hoteliers can start to take on that place management responsibility so that it can be sustained beyond the time that when the police are ready to leave. Do you want to?
Malcolm, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you had anything to respond to that gentleman in the blue shirt.
I think the specific piece was, is the public health system any better than the police? They're very sophisticated somewhat worldwide in epidemiological monitoring, and I think one of the areas where they would excel the level of competence in the police profession is in separating the prevalence effects from reporting effects. And they do it through a huge amount of data cross-matching of different types. If there's a nascent epidemic emerging in some part of the town and people don't know what it is and aren't reporting it, it can often be picked up by people Googling flu symptoms, by a sudden increase in sales of aspirin from certain pharmacies and so on. So the monitoring systems, at least in the developed world, are in place to be able to give them a clearer picture of what's going on than you'd ever get from just relying on reports.
Thank you. We'll have time for two more. Gary, and then Gloria had a question.
Question for anyone on the panel. Ron's presentation, in part seemed to show that the initial effect was quite pronounced, but then when the nature of the police department's problem-solving mechanism was changed from a specialized unit to everybody's job, or at least a widely dispersed, that might have had something to do with the diminished effect. And that brings up the whole question sort of who best does problem-oriented policing, who does it or who does it best, when could it be done by almost anybody in the police department, when does it have to be done by someone more specialized? And I just wondered if any of you had any thoughts on that from your projects. Tamara, yours was led by analysts and commanders, more so than just regular old cops?
No, it sort of follows the model of our last presentation, where we're really focusing a lot more on investigations and utilizing detectives and people with really complex sets of skills to investigate these problems. So for Pivot, for that particular problem and that project, you're really using high-level investigators to conduct problem solving. So in that sense, it is very specialized, and it's not, we've created mechanisms to retrieve information from line-level officers, because that's a critical part of this, because they're the ones who know what's going on the streets. But in the end, the people who are doing the investigations, they're a very specialized unit.
Let me give the last question or comment to Gloria.
Thanks. Gloria Laycock, UCL. I think the answer to this booster thing, how long have you got to go on, is that you go on until you've pissed the offenders off more than you piss yourselves off trying to do it. So it's who gives up. It's a kind of game of attrition. And what Tamara's project's done, which I think is really exciting, is unpick a bit of the context within which the offending is taking place, which is going to make the offenders that bit more pissed off. So they're going to think, this is a real pain working here, let's do something else. And I was reminded of so this is rambling, but we had a student looking at organized crime, crime scripts particularly, and he observed that the crime script went in a linear way, but there were two parallel scripts that nobody looked at. One was lifestyles of these offenders, because their whole lives are about hiding, so they don't vote and all the rest of it. And there was the other parallel one was a network of friends that they could call on any time. So if you only look at the crime script, you miss these sustaining pillars, which mean the offenders can just come back and do it and carry on once you've dealt with that. So there's such a great idea to look in a broader way and unpick that as much as you can, and that will help on the sustainability. So great project, sorry.
I don't know if that needs, I think that's well said. With that, I don't want to keep you from lunch. If you join me in thanking the panelists.